Britain before the war in the 1930s was a pretty divided society. It depended really where you lived, how well off you were. So one of the concerns, obviously, when war came, was how united was Britain going to be? Did those people who had felt very disaffected, disenfranchised by the Depression in the 1930s, were they going to rally to the flag? Because as Winston Churchill said, the war could be lost as much on the home front as it could be on the battlefront. And that's, I think, why we talk about the People's War. The idea that this was a total war, that everybody was in it. The First World War had been very much a fighting man's war, though of course there had been effects on the home front. The Second World War from the very beginning was a people's war, one in which everybody had to be involved, everybody suffered, but you know, the unity and the resilience and the endurance of the people was going to be hugely important in successfully prosecuting the war.
Michael Balcon is one of the most important figures in British film history. He'd arrived at Ealing in around the summer, I think, of 1938, and is trying to, I suppose, forge something of his own when the war arrives in September 1939. And in that early period of the war, Ealing, like a lot of studios, is trying to find a way of doing film propaganda. Balcon himself has very strong views about this and finds himself very much at daggers with government, which had its own views about propaganda, and which Balcon, like a lot of people in the film industry, thought was seriously wrong. One of the first things that government had done in the early part of the war was to close the cinemas for fear of, the public risk. Balcon argued very strongly against this, that film was really important for maintaining morale and could be a really important way of disseminating information. This part of the battle, at least, Balcon won. The first war films released by Ealing were quite popular, but they certainly weren't particularly realistic. And perhaps most importantly, they had the same faults as other films in terms of the way they represented class. They tended to focus on officer class heroics, the almost sort of single-handed defeat of the Germans by one brave officer. Now clearly this wasn't a very realistic representation, but also it wasn't a representation that perhaps spoke to the greater part of the audience. Now this began to change from around 1940-41, when Balcon and others begin to realise that Ealing's perhaps not quite getting it right yet. One of the ways in which it begins to change is that Balcon inherits from the GPO film unit, the prime documentary film unit of the 1930s, two very important filmmakers, Alberto Cavalcanti and Harry Watt. And with them on board, Balcon is able to sort of steer Ealing to a much more documentary-influenced, realistic, serious representation of Britain, both at home and kind of on the foreign fronts.
You've got to think of them. Another night like last night would put paid to them and damn near finish the rest of us. Yeah.
And what these films showed was that the working man actually would come up trumps. You know, they were salt of the earth, they were feisty, they were resilient.
He's a good chap. Here.
That's right.
Me too.
Worse than this.
Yeah.
They were going to pull together, they were going to prove their worth, they were going to be brave. And that was very much the agenda. But I mean, it's interesting because all those films have one agenda, which is to keep up morale, to show that, unity is going to bring us victory in a sense. But each of them also had another agenda within that large one, the People's War. For example, The Next of Kin very much fitted into the Ministry of Information campaign. Careless talk costs lives.
It's directed by somebody who's kind of new to Ealing, Thorold Dickinson, and really was just passing through. But all the same, it sort of signals Ealing's new direction. It's quite a realistic film. It's a film that really alarmed Churchill, who actually talked for a time about getting it banned because he was so worried about its threat to morale. The suggestion that an important military operation could so easily be defeated by just a few careless words.
Went the Day Well had a very interesting agenda. It was about an invasion. By 1942, the danger of an invasion had slightly passed. On the other hand, it was always in the government's interest to suggest that there might be an invasion. And what in a way, when the day well was celebrating, was sort of deep England, you know, really rural area in the Chilterns, Bramley. What happened there was, of course, that again, the toffs turned out to be not so admirable. I mean, the squire, for example, turned out to be a quisling, a sort of Nazi sympathiser, where it was the poacher and it was the ordinary people of the village, the postmistress, who stood up against the German paratroopers who were invading.
You can see this particularly in a film like The Bells Go Down, which is a film about the Blitz and about the auxiliary fire service, the volunteer fire service during the war. And this is a film that really kind of takes you down to the level of the village London.
Down beside the docks in the East End of London, they say London isn't a town, it's a group of villages. This is the story of one of those villages.
And so what we see is mostly working class communities pulling together against the threat of the bombs and bearing up. You know, living through the Blitz had a huge impact on the way Britain saw itself. And Ealing, you know, better than almost any other studio, was able to put that on screen.
Gibson, sir. Staunton, sir. Patrols. Wakeman, sir. Staunton, sir. All Britain and correct, sir.
The culmination of Ealing's grand project in the war is San Demetrio, London. It's based on a real story about an oil tanker that is in the Atlantic during the time when the oceans were patrolled by German U-boats. And the tanker is, the San Demetrio, is hit by torpedoes and its crew abandons ship. And sometime later, part of the crew, one lifeboat, stumble back onto the ship. And really, against all odds, in an Atlantic winter, the crew managed to steer the vessel home with most of its load of very valuable oil intact. And this is one of those sort of many moments during the war of kind of ordinary heroism. And it's exactly the kind of story that Ealing was telling around that time. So it's a very, very Ealing story. It's a very people's war story.
Now, what I want to talk to you about is this. We've got to decide which is the right direction. If we hold on our original course for the Clyde, we're heading for U-boats, mines, bombers and all that.
And what's really striking about it is that the crew is a crew largely without officers. The senior officers of the ship were on a different lifeboat, so they're rescued. So what's left behind is a kind of ragtag of junior officers and ordinary crewmen, and they collectively make decisions.
I look at it this way. We set out to take this petrol home, we've got it halfway already. Doesn't seem much sense turning around and taking it back again. Bowes is right. Here. Let's get out of here. Right. East it is.
It works as a kind of model for what sort of Britain that we want to build after the war. So it's really the first film, I suppose, that really starts to think about an after the war and a kind of what sort of society we want to build.
Look round you. There they are. The men and women who beat fascism, the men and women in the fighting services.
By the end of the war, of course, people were beginning to think what sort of post-war society they wanted, and they wanted to have the informal social contract that they'd forged during the war.
You know who they are? You, yourselves, millions of us.
They'd pulled together, they'd endured, they'd resisted, they'd kept on working throughout the war. They wanted that to be honoured. They didn't want to go back to the unfairnesses and injustices of the 30s. And that's, of course, one of the reasons why the Labour had such a successful landslide victory at the general election in 1945. And I think this was reflected in Ealing films too. It had shown that people united across the class barriers, across former differences, could really achieve a great deal. And if they could achieve it in the war, why couldn't they achieve it in the peace?
So at the tail end of the war, I mean, Ealing has really discovered its identity as a studio, but with the war passing, Ealing has a bit of a problem in what does it do now. It's reaching around for other ideas. It does melodrama, it does costume drama, it does adaptation, and it's not until, 1949 that Ealing sort of rediscovers an identity for itself when it starts embarking on the now incredibly famous and celebrated comedies.